I wiped the sweat from my forehead with the back of my glove, watching the heat waves rise from the asphalt ahead. The convoy had been rolling for 3 hours through nothing but scrub brush and sand, and the Desert Ridge training facility was finally coming into view. Even from this distance, the place looked wrong, too quiet, too still. Our Humvee hit a pothole and I grabbed the door frame to steady myself. The radio crackled with static as we closed the distance, but nobody was talking much. We all knew why we were here. An entire platoon had disappeared 3 weeks ago. 32 soldiers just gone. No distress calls, no bodies, no signs of struggle. Command had waited 2 weeks before admitting they had no idea what happened, and another week before deciding to send us in to figure it out. "Listen up," Sergeant Danny Perkins said from the passenger seat, turning to face the back of the vehicle. His dark eyes swept over each of us, that familiar intensity that meant business. "We go in, we document everything we see, and we report back. No heroics, no wandering off alone, no touching anything that doesn't need to be touched." I nodded along with the others, but my attention kept drifting to the facility growing larger through the windshield. Concrete buildings arranged in a rough square connected by covered walkways. Guard towers at each corner, empty now. The whole complex looked like someone had just walked away mid-sentence. "A private hall, you stick close to Corporal Mendoza," Danny continued, his voice carrying that edge it got when he was worried about one of us. "This isn't a training exercise." Grayson Hall swallowed hard enough that I could see his Adam's apple bob. The kid was 19 and looked younger, with sandy hair that never quite stayed regulation short and blue eyes that gave away every emotion. This was his first real deployment, and it showed in the way he kept checking and rechecking his gear. "Roger, Sergeant," Grayson managed, his voice pitched higher than usual. Donna Mendoza caught my eye and gave a slight shake of her head. She'd been trying to calm the kid down for the past hour, but he was wound tight as a spring. At 29, she had enough experience to know when someone was about to crack under pressure, and enough patience to try preventing it. "Roach, you bring the full medical kit," Danny said to our medic. "I want you ready for anything." Kenneth Roach adjusted his glasses and nodded once. He was the kind of guy who planned for every contingency, always carried extra supplies, always thought 3 steps ahead. If something had happened to that missing platoon, he'd be prepared for it. The convoy slowed as we approached the main gate. I could see the other vehicles spreading out in a defensive formation, engines still running. Standard procedure, but it made everything feel more real, more dangerous. The facility stretched out before us, maybe 200 yards across. 5 main buildings, all identical rectangular blocks of gray concrete. No windows on the ground level, just narrow slits higher up that barely qualified as openings. The kind of architecture designed to keep things in rather than keep things out. My stomach tightened as I took in the details. The gate stood open, hanging at an odd angle like someone had forced it. Dust covered everything in a thin layer, but not thick enough for 3 weeks of abandonment. Tire tracks crisscrossed the main courtyard, some fresh enough to have been made recently. This reminded me too much of Kandahar, when my unit had been sent to investigate a forward operating base that had gone silent. We'd found the place empty too, but there had been blood that time, lots of it. The insurgents had hit fast and hard, taken prisoners, and vanished into the mountains before anyone knew what happened. But this was different. This was a training facility in the middle of Nevada, surrounded by nothing but empty desert for 50 miles in any direction. There weren't any insurgents here, no enemy forces to worry about. So what had happened to 32 armed soldiers? "Something feels off about this," I said to Danny as our driver killed the engine. "Everything feels off about this," he replied. But his tone told me he agreed with my assessment. Danny had been doing this for 15 years, long enough to trust his instincts. "That's why we're going slow," The other vehicles had stopped now, and I could see the rest of our team climbing out, weapons ready but not raised. Standard operating procedure for investigating a potentially hostile site. Everyone moved with purpose, but nobody was rushing. Donna helped Grayson out of the Humvee, her hand on his shoulder in a way that looked casual but was meant to keep him grounded. The kid's face had gone pale, and he kept looking around like he expected something to jump out at him. "Easy, Hall," she said quietly. "We're just taking a look around." Kenneth was already pulling his medical bag from the back, running through a mental checklist I could see playing out behind his gray eyes. He moved with the precision of someone who'd done this 100 times before, every motion deliberate and efficient. I climbed out last, my boots hitting the concrete with a hollow sound that seemed to carry further than it should have. The silence here was complete, not even the hum of generators or air conditioning units that you'd expect from an active facility. Just the whisper of wind across the desert and the distant rumble of our convoy's engines. The main building stood directly ahead, a massive rectangular structure with a single entrance at ground level. Steel doors, painted military green but faded now from the sun. Above the entrance, stenciled letters spelled out Command Center in black paint that had started to peel. Danny gathered the squad with a gesture, and we formed up in a loose semicircle around him. 5 soldiers in full combat gear standing in the shadow of buildings that should have been bustling with activity. "We will sweep the command center first," Danny said, his voice carrying clearly in the dead air. "Standard room to room, but I want eyes on everything. Document positions of equipment, personal effects, anything that looks out of place." He pointed toward the entrance. "Mendoza, you take point. Garza, you're with me. Hall, stay between Mendoza and Roach. Questions?" Nobody had any. This was basic stuff, the kind of procedure we could do in our sleep. But the weight of what we might find made everything feel heavier than usual. I checked my M4 one more time, running through the motions automatically. Magazine seated, safety off, round chambered. The familiar routine helped settle my nerves, but only slightly. My hands felt steady enough, but there was something gnawing at the back of my mind that wouldn't let go. The concrete under our boots was cracked in places, with weeds pushing through the gaps. Not unusual for a desert facility, but it added to the sense of abandonment. Like nature was already trying to reclaim the place. Donna moved toward the entrance, her rifle held at the ready position. She had a way of moving that made everything look effortless, each step calculated and smooth. Grayson followed a few paces behind, trying to match her rhythm but jerking his head around at every small sound. "Breathe, Hall," Kenneth said quietly as we approached the doors. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." The kid nodded and tried to follow the advice, but his shoulders stayed bunched up around his ears. First deployment nerves were normal, but this situation would test anyone's composure. The steel doors were unlocked, which struck me as odd immediately. Military facilities didn't stay unlocked, especially not command centers. Danny reached for the handle, then paused and looked back at us. "Whatever we find in there, we document it and move on," he said. "We're not investigators, we're not detectives, we're soldiers doing a job." But even as he said it, I could see the questions in his eyes. The same ones we were all thinking, but nobody wanted to voice. Where had 32 people gone? Why had they left the doors unlocked? And why did this whole place feel like we were walking into a trap? I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, feeling the familiar weight of my gear, the bite of the straps across my shoulders. Everything was normal. Everything was standard procedure. So why did my gut keep telling me to turn around and walk away? Danny pulled the door open with a metallic screech that made us all tense. Beyond the threshold, darkness waited. The door swung shut behind us with a soft click that seemed to carry too far in the silence. Right away, something felt wrong about the air inside. Not stale or musty like you'd expect from an abandoned building, but clean. Too clean. Like someone had been maintaining the place right up until yesterday. Danny held up his fist and we all stopped. Standard protocol when entering an unknown building, but the way he paused told me he felt it too. The wrongness of it all. I adjusted my grip on my rifle and took a slow breath through my nose. Nothing. No smell of decomposition. No lingering smoke from fires. No chemical residue from tear gas or explosives. Just the faint scent of industrial floor cleaner and recycled air from the ventilation system humming overhead. We moved forward in formation, Danny taking point while I stayed close to Grayson. The kid had good instincts, but this was his first real investigation. Donna and Atlas flanked us on either side, their boots making barely a whisper on the polished concrete floor. The hallway stretched ahead of us, lit by overhead fluorescence that buzzed with that familiar institutional hum. Everything looked like it had been cleaned and organized by someone with military precision. Wall-mounted fire extinguishers hung at regulation intervals, their red paint unblemished. Emergency exit signs glowed green above doorways that led to other corridors. Bulletin boards displayed training schedules and safety reminders, the papers crisp and properly aligned. I caught myself checking the corners again, sweeping my rifle left and right, even though Danny had already cleared them. My hands felt slippery inside my gloves, and I had to consciously relax my shoulders. The pristine condition of everything was making my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. This wasn't how places looked after people vanished. I'd seen enough abandoned positions during my last deployment to know what evacuation looked like. Overturned chairs, scattered papers, personal items left behind in the rush to get out. Sometimes bullet holes in the walls or scorch marks from grenades. Always some sign of panic or haste. But here, every door was closed. Every picture frame hung straight. The motivational posters about teamwork and discipline remained undisturbed on their bulletin boards. It looked like everyone had simply finished their shift, cleaned up their workspaces, and walked out the front door. "Admin office up ahead," Danny whispered, pointing to a door with a placard that read, "Administration authorized personnel only." We approached it the same way we'd approach a potential ambush site. Atlas positioned himself to cover the hallway while Donna checked the adjacent rooms. Roach stayed behind me, his medical bag ready in case we found something unpleasant behind that door. Danny tested the handle. Unlocked. He looked back at us, raised 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. The door opened to reveal an office space that looked like it had been frozen in time. 3 desks arranged in an L shape, each with a computer monitor, keyboard, and telephone. In trays filled with paperwork sat next to out trays that were empty. Pens and pencils rested in desk organizers. A coffee mug with the facility logo sat next to one keyboard, positioned exactly where someone had left it after their last sip. I moved to the nearest desk and looked at the papers in the in tray. Training schedules, equipment requisitions, personnel evaluations. All dated from last week. All perfectly legible and properly formatted. I picked up the coffee mug and sniffed it. No smell. Completely clean, like it had been washed and dried. The computers were all powered down, but their screens were clean and their cables were neatly arranged. No dust anywhere. No forgotten snacks or personal items cluttering the workspace. Even the trash cans were empty and lined with fresh plastic bags. Roach appeared beside me and examined the desk setup with the same methodical attention he used when checking patients for injuries. He opened one of the desk drawers and found office supplies organized with the kind of precision that would make a drill sergeant proud. Staplers, paper clips, rubber bands, all sorted into separate compartments. "This is what gets me," Roach said quietly, closing the drawer. "Look at this place." I knew what he meant. We'd both seen our share of crime scenes and emergency situations. People didn't just disappear while leaving everything in perfect order. Even planned evacuations left behind evidence of preparation. Packed boxes, missing personal items, some kind of disruption to normal routines. The more I looked around, the more my anxiety ratcheted up another notch. My fingers kept drifting to my weapon's safety, checking and rechecking, even though I knew it was already off. The muscle memory from my previous deployment was kicking in, the one where we'd walked into what looked like an abandoned market only to discover it was bait for an ambush. But this felt different, worse somehow. At least with an ambush, you knew what you were dealing with once the shooting started. This was like walking through a museum exhibit labeled Military Office circa last Tuesday. Everything perfectly preserved, nothing out of place, and absolutely no indication of why 37 people had simply stopped existing. Donna poked her head into the office from the hallway. Same story in the other rooms. Everything's clean and organized. No signs of struggle, no evidence of rapid departure. Atlas joined us, shaking his head. Communications equipment is all powered down but functional. No damage, no signs of tampering. Radio logs show normal traffic up until last Friday afternoon, then nothing. I walked to the window and looked out at the training grounds. The obstacle course equipment sat undisturbed in the afternoon sun. Target ranges were clear and properly maintained. Vehicle bays showed no signs of hasty departures or abandoned equipment. The wrongness of it all was starting to feel like pressure behind my eyes. Every instinct I'd developed over years of military service was screaming that something terrible had happened here, but the evidence contradicted every possible explanation I could think of. Roach caught my attention and nodded toward the far corner of the office. A bulletin board displayed duty rosters, training schedules, and a map of the facility marked with different colored pins. Everything current, everything properly maintained. But when I looked closer, I realized what was bothering me about it. The duty roster showed assignments for this week. People were supposed to be here right now, conducting training exercises and maintaining equipment. According to the paperwork, this place should be bustling with activity. Instead, we were standing in what felt like a perfectly preserved tomb. The absence of any evidence was becoming the most disturbing evidence of all. No attack had occurred here. No emergency evacuation had taken place. No gradual abandonment over time. 37 people had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a facility that looked like they'd stepped away for lunch and never came back. I exchanged glances with Roach, and I could see the same realization dawning in his eyes. Whatever had happened to the missing platoon, it defied every conventional explanation for how military personnel could disappear. And that made it infinitely more frightening than any enemy we'd ever faced. The cafeteria made my stomach drop. Dozens of plastic trays sat scattered across the tables, each one telling the same impossible story. Half-eaten sandwiches, cups of coffee with rings of dried residue, opened bags of chips with the contents spilled across the surface. Everything looked like it had been freeze-dried in place, preserved by the desert air into a monument of interrupted routine. I walked between the tables, counting the meals. 23 trays. Each one abandoned mid-bite, as if every person eating had simultaneously decided they weren't hungry anymore and just left. The bread on the sandwiches had turned hard as cardboard, and the coffee had evaporated down to brown stains that looked like rust. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, stopping at a table where someone had been eating what looked like meatloaf and mashed potatoes. A fork stuck straight up from the potatoes, still balanced where it had been dropped. Behind me, I heard Hall's breathing change. Short, sharp inhales like he was trying to swallow air that wouldn't go down. I turned to check on him and saw his face had gone pale, sweat beading along his hairline despite the cool interior. "Hey, you good?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Hall nodded too quickly, but his hands were shaking. Kid was 19, maybe 20, and this was his first deployment outside of basic exercises. Seeing an entire mess hall frozen in time like some apocalypse movie probably wasn't what he'd signed up for. "Stay together," Perkins called out from across the room. His voice carried that edge it got when he was trying to project calm while feeling anything but. "Nobody wanders off. We document everything we see, but we don't touch anything unless absolutely necessary." Atlas Gray stood near the serving line, one hand pressed to his radio headset, the other adjusting dials with mechanical precision. I'd worked with Atlas for 2 years, and I'd never seen him fidget with his equipment like that. He was the kind of guy who could maintain communications through a sandstorm, but right now he looked frustrated. "Base, this is Team 7, he said into his microphone, requesting status update on our position. Static crackled back at him. Not the clean static of distance, but something choppy and irregular, like the signal was getting chopped up and reassembled wrong. Atlas tried again, adjusting the frequency. "Base, Team 7 requesting immediate contact." More static. This time it almost sounded like voices, but distorted beyond recognition. Atlas pulled his headset off and stared at the radio like it had personally offended him. "What's the situation?" Perkins asked, walking over. "Signal's degrading," Atlas said. "Started getting interference about 10 minutes ago. Now I can barely raise them at all." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Radio problems weren't uncommon in remote areas, but we'd had perfect contact with base all morning. Equipment didn't just fail without reason, especially not Atlas's equipment. "Keep trying," Perkins told him. "We need to maintain contact." We moved through the cafeteria in silence after that, each of us taking in the details that made the scene more unsettling. Napkins folded neatly beside plates, salt and pepper shakers positioned exactly where they'd been left. A newspaper spread open to the sports section, the date clearly visible. March 15th, 3 weeks ago. The barracks building sat adjacent to the cafeteria, connected by a covered walkway that felt like walking through a tunnel. Our footsteps bounced off the concrete walls, too loud in the stillness. Inside, the barracks looked like a museum exhibit on military life. 2 rows of bunk beds stretched down the length of the building, each one made with regulation precision. Hospital corners on the sheets, blankets pulled tight enough to bounce a quarter. Personal footlockers positioned at the foot of each bed, aligned with mathematical accuracy. But it was the personal touches that made my skin crawl. Family photos taped to the walls above bunks. Books left open on nightstands. A pair of reading glasses folded carefully next to a paperback novel. Someone's watch sitting on a small shelf, the second hand still ticking. I walked down the center aisle, taking inventory. Everything looked normal until you realized what was missing. These weren't the quarters of soldiers who had been ordered to pack up and move out. These were living spaces that had been abandoned in the middle of ordinary moments. At the 3rd bunk on the left, I stopped. A photograph was taped to the wall. A young soldier with his arm around a woman in a wedding dress, both of them grinning at the camera. Below it, a letter lay unfolded on the thin mattress, the handwriting visible from where I stood. "My dearest Michael," it began. I moved to the footlocker at the base of the bed and found it unlocked. Inside, folded uniforms sat next to civilian clothes, a small radio, and a leather wallet. I picked up the wallet and opened it, finding a driver's license for Private Michael Santos, age 22, from Phoenix. $67 in cash, credit cards, a photo of the same woman from the larger picture. "Roach," I called out. Specialist Kenneth Roach looked up from the bunk he'd been examining 3 beds down. Roach had been a medic for 8 years, and I'd seen him work through everything from training accidents to actual combat situations without his expression changing. He had the kind of professional detachment that came from seeing too much human suffering to let emotions interfere with his job. But when he walked over and I showed him the wallet, his face shifted. Not panic or fear, but something deeper. Recognition of a problem that didn't have a medical solution. "That's not protocol," he said quietly, staring at the cash in the wallet. "Soldiers don't leave personal identification behind. Not voluntarily." I closed the wallet and set it back in the footlocker exactly where I'd found it. "What about emergency evacuation? Medical emergency?" Roach shook his head. "Even then, someone would come back for personal effects, especially identification and money." He gestured toward the letter on the bed. "You don't abandon correspondence from family, not unless—" He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he was thinking. "Not unless you couldn't come back for it." I walked to another bunk and found the same story. Personal items left in place, as if their owners had simply stepped out for a moment and would return any minute. A half-finished crossword puzzle, a pack of cigarettes with 3 missing, a small framed photo of parents standing in front of a house with a happy birthday banner strung between 2 trees. The pattern repeated itself down the entire length of the barracks. Soldiers who had been living normal lives, maintaining normal routines, keeping normal connections to the world outside, and then sometime around March 15th, they had all disappeared without taking anything that mattered to them. I picked up another wallet from an open footlocker, this one belonging to Sergeant First Class David Chen. Same story, identification, cash, family photos. Everything a person would need to prove who they were and where they came from, left behind like it had suddenly become worthless. "This doesn't make sense," I said to Roach, holding up Chen's wallet. "You're telling me an entire platoon of trained soldiers just walked away from everything they owned?" Roach examined the contents of another footlocker, his movements careful and methodical. "It contradicts every psychological profile we have for military personnel," he said. "Soldiers form attachments to personal items. They carry reminders of home, maintain connections to family. Abandoning these items would require a level of psychological break that would be immediately noticeable to commanding officers." The implications settled over me like a weight. These weren't the quarters of soldiers who had planned to leave. These were the possessions of people who had expected to return. People who had every intention of finishing their letters, completing their crossword puzzles, and calling their families. People who had simply vanished from the middle of their lives. The recreational facility sprawled before us like a snapshot of interrupted leisure. Pool tables sat with balls scattered mid-game. Cue sticks abandoned across the felt. A deck of cards lay spread across one of the smaller tables, the hand frozen in what looked like the middle of a poker game. Coins and crumpled bills still sat in the center pot. The windows along the far wall drew my attention. 3 large panels that looked out over what should have been the parade grounds. Most of the glass showed a thin film of dust, the kind that builds up over weeks of abandonment. But something about the middle window looked different. I walked closer, and that's when I saw it. A handprint pressed against the glass from the inside, clear as day with every ridge and whorl visible in the smudged outline. But here's what made my skin crawl. The print looked fresh, not days old, not even hours old. Fresh, like someone had just pressed their palm against the window and walked away. The rest of the facility was starting to show signs of abandonment. Dust settling on surfaces, that stale quality creeping into the air. But this handprint cut through all of that with its sharp clarity. Someone had been here recently. Someone had stood exactly where I was standing and looked out at the parade grounds. I moved closer to the window. Close enough that my breath would have fogged the glass if I'd been breathing normally. Through the handprint's smudged outline, I could see the parade grounds stretching out in the afternoon heat. Empty concrete and withered grass baking under the sun, except it wasn't completely empty. A figure stood motionless in the distance, maybe 200 yards out, too far to make out details but close enough to know it was human. Tall, wearing what looked like standard fatigues, just standing there perfectly still, like a statue someone had placed in the middle of nowhere. My training kicked in. Identify, assess, report. But before I could process what I was seeing, something primitive and instinctive took over. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt that electric jolt you get when you know someone is watching you. Danny. My voice came out rougher than I intended. The word carried across the recreation room, cutting through the ambient silence. What is it, Garza? You need to see this. I kept my eyes locked on the figure while Danny's boots crossed the floor behind me. The person, or whatever it was, hadn't moved. Not even a shift in posture or a turn of the head, just that unnatural stillness that made my brain keep trying to reinterpret what I was seeing. Fresh handprint on the window, I said when Danny reached my shoulder. And there's someone out there. Danny leaned forward, examining the glass first. I heard him grunt acknowledgement of the handprint, then his gaze followed mine toward the parade grounds. We both looked out together. Empty concrete, withered grass. Heat waves rising from the asphalt in lazy distortions. Nothing else. I blinked hard, then looked again, scanned the entire area systematically, the way they'd trained us. Left to right, near to far, checking every possible angle and shadow. The figure was gone. Where? Danny asked. Right there. I pointed to the exact spot where I'd seen it. 200 yards out, center of the parade grounds, standing perfectly still. Danny studied the area for another long moment, then stepped back from the window. Heat mirages, he said. Tricks of light and shadow. This desert sun can make you see all kinds of things that aren't there. The dismissal hit me wrong. Not because Danny was being unreasonable. Heat mirages were a real phenomenon, especially in this kind of environment. But because what I'd seen didn't feel like a mirage. Mirages wavered and distorted. This figure had been solid, defined, unmistakably present. Maybe, I said, but I didn't believe it. Danny was already moving away from the window, back to his methodical documentation of the room. The rest of the team continued their sweep, checking equipment lockers and storage areas. Standard procedure, professional efficiency. But I stayed by the window longer than I should have, studying that empty parade ground and trying to convince myself that Danny was right. That the combination of stress and heat and the unsettling atmosphere of this place had made me see things that weren't there. The handprint on the glass said otherwise. That was real, physical, undeniable. Someone had been here recently enough to leave fresh marks, someone who might still be here. When I finally turned away from the window, I found myself checking the other windows as we moved through the facility. Quick glances, peripheral awareness, always expecting to catch movement or see another figure watching us from the distance. The paranoia felt both rational and excessive. Rational because we'd found clear evidence that someone had been here recently. Excessive because I was starting to jump at shadows. The deeper we went into the facility, the stronger that feeling became. Not just paranoia anymore, but genuine certainty that we were being observed. Every empty corridor we walked down felt like a stage with hidden audiences. Every vacant room seemed to contain invisible watchers just outside the range of vision. Atlas finished checking the last equipment locker and gave Danny the all-clear signal. Donna had swept the eastern section and found the same pattern of abandoned activities. Half-finished games, personal items left behind, no signs of struggle or forced departure. Just sudden, inexplicable absence. Underground levels next, Danny announced, consulting his facility map. Access point should be through the administrative wing. The administrative wing, where we'd eventually have to go deeper into whatever this place was hiding. But as we prepared to leave the recreational facility, I couldn't stop myself from taking one more look back at the windows. The parade grounds remained empty, baking in the afternoon sun. But that handprint was still there on the glass, still fresh, still impossible to explain away as anything other than recent human contact. Kenneth fell into step beside me as we headed toward the exit. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said quietly. The medic's observation was meant as casual conversation, but it hit closer to the truth than I was comfortable with. Whatever I'd seen out there, mirage, shadow, or something else entirely, it felt more real than anything else in this abandoned facility. More present than the missing platoon, more immediate than the scattered evidence of interrupted lives. "Just trying to figure out what happened here," I said. "Same as all of us," Kenneth replied. But he kept studying my face like he was taking my pulse through visual examination. "You sure you're tracking okay?" The question annoyed me more than it should have. Kenneth was doing his job, watching for signs of stress or breakdown in the team. But his concern felt like another dismissal, another suggestion that what I'd experienced was internal rather than external. "I'm fine," I said, probably too quickly. We moved through the facility's main corridor toward the administrative wing, our boots creating the only sound in the oppressive silence. But with each step, I felt more certain that the silence wasn't complete, that somewhere in this maze of empty rooms and abandoned spaces something was aware of our presence, something that had been here when the platoon disappeared, something that was still here now, watching us follow the same path they'd taken before vanishing completely. The underground levels waited ahead of us, promising answers that I wasn't sure I wanted to find. But as we approached the access point, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't investigating an abandoned facility anymore. We were walking into a trap that had already claimed 37 people. And whatever had taken them was still here, patient and invisible, waiting to see what we would do next. The stairwell down to the underground levels felt like descending into a tomb. Each step took us deeper into air that grew colder with every floor we passed. By the time we reached the bottom, I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of my face. The temperature drop didn't make sense. Underground areas usually stayed consistent, insulated by the earth around them. This felt deliberate, like something was actively pulling the warmth out of the air. The basement stretched out in front of us, a maze of concrete corridors lit by emergency lighting that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. The walls were lined with pipes and electrical conduits, all of it standard military construction. Hall had gone completely white. The kid was walking so close to Mendoza that he was practically stepping on her boots, his head swiveling back and forth like he expected something to jump out of the walls. His breathing had gotten shallow and quick, the kind of pattern that usually preceded a full panic attack. We found the security office at the end of the main corridor behind a heavy metal door marked with official warnings about authorized personnel only. Perkins tried the handle first, unlocked, like everything else in this place. The door swung open with a groan that carried too far in the underground silence. The office was larger than I'd expected, filled with banks of monitors and control panels that would have been impressive when the facility was operational. Now the screens showed nothing but static, row after row of white noise that created a constant low hiss in the background. The sound made my teeth itch. Daisy moved straight to the main console, her technical training taking over despite the unsettling atmosphere. She started pulling panels off the equipment, exposing the guts of the surveillance system with practiced efficiency. Cables and circuit boards lay bare under her inspection, and she worked with the kind of focused intensity that told me she was trying not to think about where we were or what we might find. "Talk to me, Ramsey," Perkins said, positioning himself near the door where he could watch the hallway. "What are we looking at?" She had her head buried inside one of the main units, following cables with her flashlight. "System's still getting power, Sergeant. All the hardware looks intact." No physical damage to the drives or the recording equipment. That should have been good news. If the equipment was functional, we might be able to recover footage from the days leading up to the disappearance. Video evidence could tell us exactly what happened to the missing platoon, maybe even show us where they went. But I could tell from Daisy's tone that we weren't going to get that lucky. She pulled out one of the hard drives and connected it to a portable diagnostic unit she'd brought with her. The device hummed to life, running through its analysis protocols while we waited in the static-filled silence. After a few minutes, she disconnected everything and moved to the next drive, then the next. "Sergeant," she said finally, her voice flat with professional disappointment. "The drives are clean, completely clean, not corrupted or damaged, wiped. Someone went through every single storage device in this system and erased everything." The implications hit me like a punch to the gut. Military surveillance systems didn't get wiped by accident. Someone with technical knowledge and administrative access had deliberately destroyed every piece of recorded evidence from the facility, which meant whatever happened here, someone wanted to make sure there would be no record of it. "How clean are we talking?" I asked, moving closer to the console. "Recent deletion or complete formatting?" Daisy's hands moved across her diagnostic equipment, pulling up readouts I couldn't interpret. Professional-grade data destruction, multiple overwrite passes, random data patterns, the works. This wasn't some panic deletion job. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and had the time to do it right. Hall made a small noise from the corner where he'd pressed himself against the wall. When I looked over, he was staring at one of the blank monitors with wide eyes, his breathing getting more erratic by the minute. "Do you hear that?" he whispered so quietly I almost missed it. Mendoza moved closer to him, her voice gentle but firm. "Hear what, Hall? What are you picking up?" "The whispers," he said, still staring at the static on the screen. "They're talking about us. They know we're here." I listened, straining to pick up anything beyond the constant hiss of the surveillance equipment. All I could hear was white noise, the same electronic static that had been playing since we entered the room. But Hall was reacting like someone was speaking directly to him, his head tilted at an angle that suggested he was trying to make out specific words. Mendoza put a hand on his shoulder, the kind of steady contact that was supposed to ground someone who was losing their grip on reality. "Hall, look at me. Look at me, not at the screen. There's nothing there but static. No voices, no whispers." But Hall wasn't listening to her anymore. His attention had shifted to something beyond our immediate group, his eyes tracking movement that none of the rest of us could see. His breathing had gone from quick and shallow to the kind of hyperventilation that would put him on the ground if it didn't stop soon. "They're coming closer," he said, his voice rising with panic. "They're right behind us. Can't you see them?" I turned to check the hallway behind us. Empty corridor, same as it had been since we came down here. The temperature had dropped again while we'd been in the security office. What had started as uncomfortably cool was now genuinely cold, the kind of chill that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. I could feel it pressing against my skin through my uniform, an unnatural cold that had nothing to do with the building's climate control system. Hall's panic reached a breaking point. He started shouting at the empty air in front of him, words that came out too fast and too scrambled to make sense. Something about shadows and watching, and they know we're here. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't keep them still, and the hyperventilation was making him dizzy enough that he had to lean against the wall to stay upright. Mendoza was doing her best to calm him down, using the kind of steady, authoritative voice that usually worked on soldiers who were losing their composure. But Hall was beyond responding to verbal commands. Whatever he was experiencing had completely overridden his military training and his ability to follow orders. "That's enough," Perkins said, his command voice cutting through Hall's panicked shouting. "We're moving out, now." The decision came with obvious relief from everyone in the room. Whatever information we might have found in the security office wasn't worth watching one of our people fall apart in real time. Hall needed to get out of this underground maze before his panic turned into something that could put the whole team at risk. But as we started moving toward the stairwell, the cold seemed to follow us. Not the gradual temperature change you'd expect from moving through different areas of a building, but an active presence that pressed against us from all directions. I could feel it seeping through my clothing, settling into my bones with a weight that felt deliberate and malevolent. At the bottom of the stairwell, I took one last look back at the security office. The door stood open, spilling static-filled light into the corridor, and beyond it lay all the evidence we'd hoped to find. 37 people had disappeared from this facility without a trace, and someone had made sure we'd never see what really happened to them. The walk back toward the entrance should have been simple. Retrace our steps, exit through the main lobby, get in the trucks, drive away. Standard extraction procedure after a reconnaissance mission that had turned up nothing but empty rooms and unanswered questions. Except the facility wasn't cooperating with our plan. I noticed the first change about halfway up from the underground levels. The door to what we'd identified as a supply closet during our initial sweep now stood closed, its metal surface reflecting the overhead fluorescence in a way that made my eyes want to look elsewhere. When we'd passed it 3 hours ago, heading down to investigate the lower floors, that door had been propped open with a rubber wedge. I'd made a mental note of it because open doors meant clear sight lines, and clear sight lines meant fewer places for threats to hide. Now the wedge sat on the floor 2 feet away from the door frame, kicked aside or moved by something I couldn't explain. "Perkins," I said, keeping my voice low. "That supply closet." Danny followed my gaze and stopped walking. Behind him, the rest of our team bunched up in the narrow hallway like a traffic jam. Atlas shifted his weight from foot to foot, and I could hear Grayson's breathing getting shallow the way it did when his nerves started getting the better of him. "Door's closed now," Danny said after a moment. "Wasn't closed before." "No, it wasn't." We stood there looking at a closed door that should have been open, and nobody had a good explanation for how that might have happened. The facility's power grid was still running, so maybe the building had some kind of automated security system that sealed doors after a certain amount of time. Maybe the wedge had been positioned poorly and finally gave way to gravity and the door's weight. Maybe one of us had bumped it during our initial sweep and just hadn't noticed. All reasonable explanations that didn't explain the feeling crawling up my spine like ice water. Danny pulled out his sidearm and approached the door. The rest of us spread out behind him, weapons ready, following protocol for clearing an unknown space. He turned the handle and pushed the door open in one smooth motion. Empty. Just shelves lined with cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment, exactly like we'd found it the first time. But the wedge hadn't moved itself. We continued toward the main level, and I started paying attention to details I'd missed on the way down. A fire extinguisher mounted on the wall that now hung at a slight angle like someone had bumped into it recently. A bulletin board with notices and announcements where several papers now curled at the corners, though I could have sworn they'd been flat against the cork surface when we passed them earlier. Small changes. Subtle shifts that could have been caused by air currents or settling building materials or any number of mundane factors. Except my gut wasn't buying the mundane explanations anymore. By the time we reached the ground floor, the feeling of wrongness had shifted into something more active, more present, like walking through a crowded room where everyone stops talking to watch you pass, except the room was empty and the watchers were invisible. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself checking corners and doorways we'd already cleared, half expecting to catch movement in my peripheral vision. Donna had gone quiet, which wasn't like her. She usually kept up a steady stream of observations and tactical commentary during operations, but now she walked with her rifle at ready position and her head on a swivel. Kenneth moved closer to the group's center, abandoning his usual position as our rear guard. Even Atlas had stopped fiddling with his radio equipment and kept both hands on his weapon. We all felt it. None of us wanted to be the first one to say what we were feeling out loud. The main lobby looked exactly the same as when we'd entered 4 hours ago. Same scattered furniture, same reception desk with its neat stacks of paperwork, same motivational posters on the walls encouraging physical fitness and unit cohesion. But the space felt different now, smaller somehow. Like the walls had moved inward while we'd been exploring the building's depths. Danny pushed through the front doors first, and the late afternoon sunlight hit us like a physical blow after hours under fluorescent lighting. I squinted against the glare and stepped outside, ready to feel the relief of open air and unlimited sightlines. Instead, I felt my blood turn to ice water. Figures stood scattered across the desert landscape beyond the parking lot. Maybe a dozen of them, maybe more. Too far away to make out faces or details, but close enough to see they were human-shaped and motionless. They faced the facility like an audience watching a performance, positioned at irregular intervals across the scrubland that stretched toward the horizon. They hadn't been there when we'd arrived. "Perkins," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. "We've got company." Danny followed my line of sight and went completely still. Behind us, the rest of the team emerged from the building and spread out in a defensive formation without anyone giving orders. Training kicked in automatically when faced with an unknown threat, even when that threat was just people standing in the distance doing absolutely nothing. "How long have they been there?" Donna asked. "They weren't there when we went inside." "You sure about that?" I was sure. I'd done a complete 360 scan of our surroundings during our initial approach, checking for potential sniper positions and ambush sites. The desert had been empty except for scrub brush and the occasional Joshua tree. No people, no vehicles, no signs of human presence anywhere within visual range. Now there were figures watching us from multiple directions, and they stood perfectly still in a way that made my skin crawl. "We're leaving," Danny said. "Now, everyone move to the vehicles. Stay alert, but don't engage unless fired upon." We started across the parking lot at a quick walk that wanted to become a run. The asphalt stretched between us and our trucks like an obstacle course designed by someone who understood exactly how exposed and vulnerable we'd feel crossing open ground under observation. Each step took us further from the relative cover of the building and deeper into the killing field of the parking area. That's when the weight hit me. It started as pressure behind my eyes, like the beginning of a sinus headache. But within seconds it had spread down through my shoulders and chest, making each breath require conscious effort. My legs felt like I was walking through knee-deep water, every step requiring more energy than the last. The weight pressed down from above and seemed to come from inside my bones at the same time, crushing and expanding simultaneously in a way that defied physics. I stumbled and caught myself against the side of a pickup truck, breathing hard. "You okay?" Donna asked, but her voice sounded strained too. Looking around, I could see the same struggle on everyone's faces. Kenneth moved like he was carrying a full pack loaded with rocks. Atlas had slowed to barely more than a shuffle. "Something's wrong," I managed to say between breaths. That's when Atlas went down. He pitched forward suddenly, his hands flying out to break his fall against the asphalt. For a moment he lay there gasping, then scrambled backward on his hands and knees like something was chasing him. "Something grabbed my ankle," he said, staring at the empty space where he'd been walking. I felt fingers. Human fingers. We all looked at the ground where Atlas had fallen. Nothing there but cracked asphalt and a few scattered pebbles. No hands, no ropes, no tripwires. Nothing that could have grabbed him. But the panic in his eyes was real. "Move, move, move!" Danny shouted, and whatever spell had been holding us broke. We ran for the trucks, that crushing weight forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Grayson was crying openly now, tears streaming down his face as he stumbled toward the passenger side of our vehicle. Kenneth hauled Atlas to his feet and half-carried him the remaining distance to the truck beds. I threw myself into the back of our transport just as Zane fired up the engine. The diesel roared to life with a sound that was the most beautiful thing I'd heard all day. Through the rear window, I watched the facility shrinking behind us as Zane accelerated toward the access road. The figures in the distance hadn't moved. They stood in the same positions, facing the same direction, watching our retreat with the patience of people who had all the time in the world. And as the miles opened up between us and Desert Ridge, as the facility became a distant speck in the rearview mirror, I couldn't shake one final realization that settled into my chest like a cold stone. We weren't escaping, we were being released. The conference room at Fort Carson felt smaller than usual when I walked in 3 days later. Colonel Lewis sat at the head of the polished table, her steel-gray hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. A stack of manila folders lay in front of her, along with a digital recorder that she clicked on the moment Danny closed the door behind our squad. "This is a formal debriefing regarding the reconnaissance mission to Desert Ridge Training Facility," she said, her voice carrying that crisp authority that made junior officers stand straighter. "I need detailed accounts from each of you regarding what you observed during your time at the facility." Danny went first, keeping his report clinical and factual. Abandoned buildings, personal effects left behind, no signs of struggle. He mentioned the temperature anomalies in the underground levels but presented them as curious rather than alarming. When he finished, Lewis made notes without looking up. Kenneth followed with his medical assessment. No biological hazards detected, no obvious signs of violence or injury. He described the strange cleanliness of the facility but suggested it could be explained by the dry desert climate preserving conditions better than expected. One by one, my squad mates delivered their accounts. Each report sounded reasonable, measured, professional. Each one drained away the horror of what we'd actually experienced until it sounded like we'd simply walked through some empty buildings and found nothing particularly noteworthy. Then it was my turn. "Sir, the evidence suggests something highly unusual occurred at that facility," I began. The personal effects weren't just abandoned, they were left mid-activity. Coffee cups still warm, letters half-written, games interrupted mid-play. This wasn't a planned evacuation or normal departure. Lewis finally looked up from her notes. "Sergeant Garza, are you suggesting 37 trained military personnel simply vanished into thin air?" "I'm suggesting we witnessed evidence of an event that defies conventional explanation. The temperature drops, the unnatural preservation of the scene, the fact that vehicles and equipment were left behind. Temperature fluctuations in underground facilities are common," she interrupted. "Desert climates create unique preservation conditions. As for the vehicles and equipment, there are any number of logistical explanations for why they might have been left behind during a reassignment." "With respect, sir, this wasn't a reassignment. People don't leave their wedding rings behind during routine transfers." Lewis set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the ventilation system cycling in the background. "Sergeant Garza, I've reviewed your service record. You've experienced significant trauma during your previous deployment. It's not uncommon for extreme environmental conditions to trigger psychological responses in personnel with your history." The words hit like a physical blow. "Sir, this has nothing to do with..." The official conclusion of this investigation is that extreme desert conditions, combined with the psychological stress of entering an abandoned facility, Likely caused heightened perceptions and possible hallucinations among the reconnaissance team. She opened one of the folders and began writing. The missing platoon will be classified as AWOL pending further investigation through appropriate channels. AWOL. The word came out sharper than I intended. Sir, these people didn't go absent without leave. Something happened to them. That determination is above your pay grade, Sergeant. Danny cleared his throat. Sir, if I may, Sergeant Garza makes valid points about the condition of the personal effects. The debriefing is concluded. Lewis clicked off the recorder. You're all to return to normal duties. No further discussion of this matter outside official channels. We filed out in silence. In the hallway, Danny caught my arm. Let it go, Mav. You saw what I saw. Yeah, I did. And I also know when to pick my battles. He glanced back toward the conference room. This isn't one you're going to win. But I couldn't let it go. Over the following weeks, I found myself spending off-duty hours in the base library, digging through military archives and newspaper databases. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The first case dated back to 1973. A training unit of 15 soldiers had vanished during exercises at Desert Ridge. The official report cited equipment failure and navigation errors in harsh terrain. Bodies were never recovered. 1987 brought the disappearance of a maintenance crew. 8 personnel who had gone to the facility for routine repairs. The report mentioned severe weather conditions and suggested the crew had sought shelter elsewhere, though no trace of them was ever found. The third case happened in 1995. A small reconnaissance team similar to ours had been sent to assess the facility's condition. They radioed in their arrival and were never heard from again. The official explanation blamed communication failures and equipment malfunctions. 3 incidents spanning over 20 years. 3 sets of missing personnel. 3 official reports that explained everything away with conventional causes while carefully avoiding any mention of the disturbing details that must have been found at the scene. I printed copies of everything I could find and started a file. Military bureaucracy had a way of making inconvenient truths disappear, but I wasn't going to let that happen this time. Returning to normal duties proved impossible. During patrol exercises, I found myself scanning the horizon with an intensity that made my squad mates uncomfortable. The vast emptiness of the Colorado Plains reminded me too much of that desert landscape. Too much of the feeling that something was watching from just beyond the edge of perception. That's when I started noticing them. The first time happened during a routine training exercise. I was positioned on a ridge providing overwatch for the squad moving through the valley below. Movement caught my eye about 200 meters to the east, a figure standing motionless among the scrub brush. Just standing there perfectly still, facing in my direction. I raised my binoculars for a better look, but the lenses showed nothing except empty terrain. I lowered them and the figure was gone. Equipment malfunction, I told myself. Trick of the light, heat shimmer creating false images. But it happened again 2 days later. And then again. Always at the edge of my vision. Always perfectly still. Always gone the moment I tried to focus on them directly. I started keeping a journal, documenting each sighting with military precision. Date, time, location, weather conditions, duration of observation. The entries accumulated faster than I wanted to admit. March 15th, 14:30 hours. Figure observed 300 meters northwest during perimeter check. Disappeared when viewed through scope. March 18th, 0600 hours. Motionless silhouette visible on eastern ridgeline during morning PT. Vanished when I turned for direct observation. March 22nd, 2100 hours. Figure standing near motor pool during evening rounds, gone when security lights activated. The sightings followed no pattern I could identify, except for one disturbing constant. They only happened when I was alone. Kenneth noticed my increased vigilance during squad activities. "You're wound pretty tight lately, Mav. Everything okay?" "Just staying alert. Staying alert is good, jumping at shadows isn't." But they weren't shadows. I knew the difference between paranoia and genuine observation. These figures had substance, presence, purpose. They were watching me with the same patient intensity I'd felt at Desert Ridge. The facility might have released us, but something had followed me home. Danny tried a different approach during a poker game in the barracks. "Look, we all saw some weird stuff out there, but it's over now. Time to move on." "Is it over?" I kept my voice low, aware that other soldiers were within earshot. "Because I don't think whatever we encountered is done with us." "Jesus, Mav, listen to yourself." But I wasn't imagining things. The presence that had inhabited Desert Ridge, that ancient, patient intelligence that had claimed 3 groups of soldiers over 20 years, had turned its attention to me. Maybe because I was the only one who refused to accept the official explanation. Maybe because I was the only one still looking for answers. The journal grew thicker as weeks turned to months. My squad mates tried to include me in normal activities, but I found it hard to relax when I knew I was being watched. Even during downtime, I kept one eye on the windows, one hand near my sidearm. Grayson cornered me after evening chow one night. "This isn't healthy, Sarge. You're making everyone nervous." "Good. Nervous keeps you alive." "Nervous keeps you isolated," he corrected. "When's the last time you got a full night's sleep? When's the last time you went off base for anything besides necessities?" I couldn't answer because I couldn't remember. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford when every shadow might conceal a watcher. Off-base activities felt like unnecessary risks when I didn't know how far the presence's influence extended, but I wasn't going to stop documenting what I observed. Someone needed to maintain an accurate record of what was really happening. Someone needed to be ready to warn the next group of soldiers who might be sent to Desert Ridge. Because there would be a next group. Military bureaucracy had a way of forgetting inconvenient lessons, and Desert Ridge would eventually attract new attention. New personnel would be assigned to investigate the facility's potential for reactivation. New squads would drive across that empty desert, convinced they were dealing with nothing more than an abandoned training site. And when that happened, I would be ready to tell them the truth about what waited in those buildings. About the presence that claimed anyone who ventured too close to its territory. About the inhuman intelligence that had been feeding on military personnel for decades while official reports explained away every disappearance with mundane causes. My squad mates had chosen to move forward to accept the official explanation and get on with their lives. I respected that choice, even envied it sometimes during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. But I couldn't make the same choice. Not when I knew what was still out there, patient and invisible, waiting for the next opportunity to add more names to its collection. Someone had to stay vigilant. Someone had to remember what really happened at Desert Ridge. Someone had to be ready to warn others about the danger that lurked in that desert facility, no matter how crazy it made me sound. That someone was going to be me.